Rain kept sliding down the emergency room windows in thin, crooked lines by the time she finally stopped shaking enough to fill out the paperwork. Her son was somewhere behind the double doors now. A nurse had taken him only minutes earlier. Speaking too fast. Asking questions she could barely process through the ringing in her ears. Insurance. À la guise. Emergency contact. The kind of questions exhausted people answered every day under fluorescent lights, while pretending they were not terrified. She still had rainwater on her sleeves. One sneaker was stained dark from kneeling on wet pavement beside her son before the ambulance arrived. The waiting room smelled like burnt coffee and disinfectant. A television mounted in the corner played muted late-night news that nobody was watching. Except one man. He sat beneath the flickering blue light with both hands folded loosely in front of him. Dark coat still damp from the storm outside. Too still. Too awake. The kind of man people noticed without wanting to stare at directly. At first, she thought he was waiting for somebody else. A wife. A brother. Another patient somewhere deeper in the hospital. But every few minutes, he looked toward the hallway leading to her son's room. Not casually. Carefully, like he was counting every person who walked through it. A nurse passed him once and slowed slightly without meaning to. People noticed him, even when they tried not to. The man nodded once. Nothing more. No pacing. No complaints. No phone calls. Just silence. Hours passed that way. Rain against the windows. Hospital announcements overhead. Vending machine hum. And every single time she looked up from her seat, he was still there. Around 3 a.m, one of the nurses brought her a paper cup of coffee she had not asked for. He paid for it already. The nurse said quietly. Before she could ask who, the nurse glanced toward the television light. The man never looked over. He only kept staring toward the hallway where her son was sleeping. That was the first moment something inside her shifted. Not trust. She wasn't that tired yet. But something had shifted, because exhausted men did not sit inside emergency rooms all night for strangers' children. Not unless something was terribly wrong. Or terribly personal. By 4 a.m, the emergency room had become quieter in the way hospitals sometimes did right before sunrise. Not peaceful. Just exhausted. The waiting room chairs had emptied. Somewhere down the hallway, a janitor slowly pushed a mop bucket beneath the fluorescent lights, while nurses traded shifts with tired voices and paper cups in their hands. Her son was stable now. At least according to the doctor who had finally spoken to her nearly an hour earlier. Mild concussion. Observation overnight. They wanted to monitor him until morning because he had blacked out briefly after the accident. She sat beside his hospital bed for a long time after that. Listening to the soft electronic rhythm of the monitor beside him, children looked smaller in hospitals. Smaller than they should. One of his hands remained curled loosely around the sleeve of her sweater even while asleep. Then she looked toward the doorway again. The man was still there. Not inside the room. Never inside. Always somewhere near the hallway beyond it. Sometimes seated beneath the television. Sometimes standing near the vending machines, once near the elevators. Watching the entrance doors reflected in the glass. But always there. Around 4:30, she stepped quietly out into the hallway to buy water from the vending machine near the elevators. She reached into her purse automatically and stopped. Almost empty. A few folded bills. Laundry coins. A grocery receipt. Nothing else. For a moment, she just stared at the machine without pressing anything. Then a bottle dropped into the tray below with a hard plastic crack. She looked up immediately. The man stood several feet away near the opposite wall. One hand lowered from the keypad. "I can pay you back," she said quietly. His eyes stayed on the glass entrance doors. "No." His voice surprised her. Low. Tired. Rough around the edges like someone who had not slept properly in years. "You've been here a long time," she said. "So have you." It wasn't flirtation, just two exhausted people noticing each other. She studied him more carefully under the brighter light, Early 40s, maybe. Dark coat wrinkled from sitting too long. A faint bruise near his jaw. One hand flexing occasionally like an old injury still hurt in cold weather. He looked like the kind of man who checked exits without thinking about it. "You know my son?" she asked. For the first time that night, he looked directly at her. "He spoke to me once," he said. No explanation after that. Just enough truth to keep her uneasy. A pair of paramedics entered through the sliding doors then, guiding another patient inside on a stretcher. The man's attention shifted immediately. His entire posture changed without movement becoming obvious. Eyes toward the entrance. Shoulders tightening slightly. One hand lowering near his coat pocket, before relaxing again once he saw the patient's family behind the stretcher. She noticed all of it, and suddenly the waiting room no longer felt ordinary anymore. "You should go home," she said quietly. He looked toward her son's room again. For a moment, exhaustion crossed his face openly. "I can't," he said. Then he walked back toward the hallway outside her son's room and resumed watching the corridor like he had never left it at all. An hour later, her son opened his eyes for the first time since the ambulance ride. And the first thing he asked was, "Is that guy still here?" For a second, she thought her son was still half asleep, but his eyes were open, focused, looking past her toward the hallway. "Yeah," she answered carefully. "He's still here." Her son blinked slowly. "The tall guy." She turned toward the doorway instinctively. The man was there again. Not close, just visible beyond the partially open door. Standing farther down the hall near the nurse's station with his attention fixed toward the elevators. Watching. Always watching. "How do you know him?" she asked. "At the store," her son murmured. "What store?" "The one near the bus stop." He rubbed one eye weakly against the blanket. He dropped oranges. Apparently that had been important enough to remember. He looked mad at everybody. The boy continued softly. "But not at me." She glanced toward the hallway again. "Did he talk to you?" Her son nodded faintly. "He asked why I was outside in the rain. And what did you say?" "That you were working late." The answer landed harder than she expected. "He bought me hot chocolate," her son added. "But he didn't stay." Her son's eyes drifted toward the hallway again. "Why's he here now?" She opened her mouth. Nothing came out. A nurse entered quietly then to check vitals and medication timing. Temperature. Light in the eyes. A few routine questions. When the nurse finished writing notes on the chart, she lowered her voice slightly. "He's doing better." Relief hit hard enough that she suddenly needed to sit down again. The nurse adjusted the blanket around her son carefully. Then her eyes flicked once toward the hallway. "He hasn't left all night." "No." The nurse nodded slowly. "He asked 3 different doctors for updates before anyone realized he wasn't family." That cold, uneasy feeling returned immediately. What exactly did he tell them? That he was waiting. The nurse capped her pen. He didn't raise his voice once. For some reason, that detail unsettled her more than anger would have. Because men who scared people usually acted like they knew it. This man behaved like he wanted as little attention as possible. Her son was asleep again already when she stepped quietly into the hallway. The man noticed her immediately. "He remembers you," she said softly. Something shifted faintly in his expression. "He remembers hot chocolate." For the first time, all night. The corner of his mouth moved slightly. "He talks too much when he's nervous," she continued. The man looked toward her son sleeping inside the room. "No," he said quietly. "He talks when he feels safe." The hallway fell silent again after that. Then she noticed something else. The man never once crossed the doorway into her son's room. Not even now. He stayed exactly where he was, like the line between the hallway and that room mattered to him. A few minutes later, he turned his head sharply toward the elevators. This time, when she followed his gaze, she saw 2 unfamiliar men step onto the floor, scanning the hallway before pretending not to. The man beside her became very still. You know them? She asked under her breath. No. The answer came too quickly. One of the men glanced briefly toward her son's room while passing. Only for a second, still enough to make cold pressure settle low in her stomach. The man beside her noticed it too. She knew he had because his gaze shifted instantly toward the room behind her. Measuring distance. Doorway. Hallway. Elevator. Nurse's station. Every movement around them suddenly seemed to pass through him first, before reaching anyone else. The two strangers disappeared around the far end of the corridor near radiology. Only then did the tension in his shoulders loosen slightly. You should tell security if something's wrong, she said quietly. They won't stay long. That's not what I asked. This time he looked at her, mostly exhaustion in his face. I don't want trouble near your son, he said. The sentence disturbed her more than a threat would have, because it sounded honest. A nurse walked past carrying fresh linens, forcing both of them to step slightly apart in the narrow hallway. The normal hospital movement around them continued uninterrupted. Phones ringing softly at the station. An elderly patient coughing somewhere nearby. A tired doctor rubbing his eyes while reading charts. Everything ordinary. Except him. He checked the elevators again. Then the stairwell door farther down the floor. Then the windows overlooking the parking structure below. You've been doing that all night, she said. What watching exits? A faint pause. Habit. People who lived normal lives did not move like that. People who expected violence did. Inside the room, her son shifted slightly in bed. The man's head turned immediately toward the sound. Too fast. Too instinctive. A few minutes later, one of the strangers returned alone from the far end of the floor. This time he walked slower. His eyes passed briefly over her. Then the room. Then stopped on the man beside her. Neither of them spoke, but the silence between them felt old. Recognized. The stranger gave the smallest nod before continuing toward the elevators again. The doors closed behind him moments later. Only then did she realize she had stopped breathing normally. What was that, she asked. The man rubbed one hand slowly across his jaw. They were making sure I was still here. The hallway suddenly felt colder. Why, he looked toward her son's room again before answering, because I'm supposed to be somewhere else. The sentence stayed with her long after he stopped speaking. He was not staying near her son because he felt safe there. He was staying because he believed the danger would follow him instead of the child. A doctor entered the room, then carrying updated charts. The man stepped back immediately, creating distance again before anyone had to ask him to, like he had spent the entire night teaching himself where he was allowed to stand. The doctor stayed inside the room less than 10 minutes. Concussion symptoms looked stable. No internal bleeding. Observation until morning. Then likely discharge if the headaches improved. Ordinary words. The kind people waited all night, hoping to hear. When the doctor finally left, she sat beside her son again and felt the first real wave of exhaustion hit her body all at once. Her son was sleeping deeply again now. One cheek pressed slightly into the pillow. Hospital blanket twisted near his legs. She looked toward the doorway automatically. The man was gone. The empty hallway unsettled her immediately, which was strange. If you think about it, a few hours earlier, she would have wanted him gone. She found him near the vending machines, not watching the exits this time, just standing there with one hand braced lightly against the wall beside the coffee machine. Head lowered slightly. Under the vending machine light, he finally looked exhausted instead of dangerous. His other hand pressed briefly against his ribs beneath the coat, before dropping again, once he sensed movement nearby. Injury. The realization came quietly. You should sit down, she said before thinking about it. He looked faintly surprised. I'm fine. It was the kind of lie tired people stopped arguing about. She walked closer this time, stopping near the vending machine beside him. You haven't slept. He glanced toward her son's room again before answering. Not important. That depends. His jaw tightened faintly. You should be with your son, he said. I was. And now she looked down the hallway toward the room, then back at him. Now she honestly did not know, because every instinct told her to keep distance from him. But another part of her had started noticing things she could not unsee anymore. The way he stepped back whenever nurses entered the room. The way he never interrupted doctors. The way he watched the floor like he was trying to keep something terrible from crossing into it. You keep acting like you're not allowed near him, she said quietly. That landed harder than she expected. For a moment, something crossed his face too quickly to fully read. Then gone again. He shouldn't get used to seeing me around. The answer sat between them heavily, because it did not sound like rejection. It sounded like someone trying very carefully not to damage something. The storm outside had weakened. The city beyond the windows looked pale and exhausted beneath dawn light. The man reached into his coat pocket, then paused suddenly. A phone vibrating. He stared at the screen without answering. After several seconds, he silenced the call entirely and returned the phone to his pocket, untouched. You can leave. You know, she said. I know, but you won't. A long silence followed. Then finally, no. Simple. Certain. He said it simply. Like leaving would cost him something. A nurse approached from farther down the hall, carrying fresh medication trays. You should drink something before your body gives up on you, she told him casually. The familiarity in her voice caught attention immediately, like she had already tried saying the same thing earlier that night. The man gave a tired nod but never touched the coffee. After the nurse disappeared around the corner, she looked back at him again. How long have you been awake? He stared toward the hospital windows for several seconds. Long enough. The words should have sounded dismissive. Instead, they sounded honest, because she suddenly realized something she had not considered before. Maybe he was not standing outside her son's room all night because he was dangerous. Maybe he was standing there because he genuinely did not know where else to go anymore. A few minutes later, her son stirred again inside the room, and before she could even turn toward the sound, the man was already moving back toward the hallway outside the door. Her son woke slowly this time. The headache had eased a little. The nurse checked his pupils once more, asked him simple questions, then left them alone again, with the promise that breakfast trays would arrive after shift change. Morning had finally started touching the windows now. The storm outside was breaking apart into thin gray rain. Her son pushed himself up slightly against the pillow and looked toward the hallway. He's still here. The man stood near the far wall outside the room, speaking quietly into his phone for the first time all night. Whatever the voice on the other end said made his expression harden briefly, before flattening again into exhaustion. Then he noticed the child awake, and immediately ended the call. Her son gave a small wave. The man hesitated, only for a second. Then he walked closer to the doorway than he had all night, before stopping again at the same invisible line he refused to cross. You look better, he said. My head hurts less. The man accepted that information with strange intensity. You should still rest. You sound like my mom. Something unexpectedly human crossed the man's face. Her son studied him sleepily for another moment. You never drank your coffee. The paper cup still sat untouched near the vending machine behind him. The man glanced toward it briefly. I forgot. You forget a lot. That almost became a smile. She watched the exchange quietly from beside the bed, and suddenly the entire night rearranged itself emotionally in front of her. This man was not staying out of obligation. He genuinely cared whether her son woke up. Her son shifted carefully against the pillow again. Mom said you looked mad when we met. The man leaned one shoulder lightly against the hallway wall. She was right. You didn't look mad at me. The man lowered his eyes briefly toward the floor. No, he said quietly. I wasn't. Her son accepted the answer easily. Then he frowned slightly, like he had remembered something important. You left really fast that day. The room grew still. Even she felt it. Something invisible tightening around the conversation. You kept looking across the street. The child continued softly. The man said nothing. You dropped your oranges. And then those guys showed up. The silence afterward felt heavier than anything spoken all night. The black car. Her son murmured. Remember? The man finally looked at her then. And for the first time, she saw something dangerously close to vulnerability beneath all the restraint. Not fear for himself. Fear of what this conversation might pull closer to the room. You should rest, he told the child gently. But her son kept looking at him. You almost got hit. There it was. It wasn't dramatic, just a tired child remembering details adults hoped would disappear on their own. Rain. Crosswalk. Bus stop. A black car stopping too suddenly. The bruising beneath the coat. The strangers on the floor earlier. The constant watching. You knew something happened. She said quietly. I knew what almost happened. Her son looked confused now. What happened? The man stared toward the rain-covered hospital windows instead of answering immediately. When we met, he said softly, I was supposed to stay where I was. Simple words. But she understood there was much more beneath them. You talked to me instead, her son said. A faint nod. And then, there were people waiting nearby. For you, yes. Her son blinked slowly, trying to follow the conversation through exhaustion. You left after that. I had to. The child thought about this quietly. Did they hurt you? The man looked down briefly toward his ribs. A little. Her son absorbed that answer, with the uncomplicated seriousness children sometimes carried. Then he said the thing that finally broke something open inside the room. You came here because you thought something bad would happen to me too. Silence. The monitor beside the bed continued its soft, steady rhythm. Rain tapped lightly against the windows, and the man standing outside the doorway looked suddenly more tired than dangerous, because he could not deny it. Eventually, he answered in the quietest voice she had heard from him all night. Yes. No speeches followed. Just truth settling heavily into the room between exhausted people who suddenly understood each other far more than they wanted to. Her son looked at him for another moment, before drifting slowly back against the pillow again. But before sleep fully took him, he murmured softly, You should have drank the coffee. The man lowered his eyes briefly. And this time, the smile reached his face. For real. Small. Tired. Gone almost immediately. But real enough that she finally saw the loneliness underneath everything else. After that, the room became quieter in a different way. The room felt different after that. Quieter. Careful. Her son drifted back to sleep slowly beneath the thin hospital blanket, while morning light spread pale gray across the floor tiles beside the bed. The storm outside had nearly passed. Rain still clung to the windows. But the city beyond them had started moving again. The man stepped back into the hallway once her son was asleep again, creating distance automatically. Like closeness was something he only allowed himself in small, accidental moments. She followed him out a minute later. The hospital floor felt different now that dawn had arrived. Less isolated. More exposed. Night nurses exchanged quiet goodbyes near the station. A volunteer pushed fresh newspapers through the waiting room. Coffee smell replaced disinfectant little by little. The man stood near the windows overlooking the parking structure below. Still watching. But not with the same urgency as before. Whatever danger had circled the hospital during the night seemed farther away now. You should probably get that looked at. He glanced toward her without understanding at first. Then she nodded slightly toward his ribs beneath the coat. For a moment, he looked almost embarrassed to have been noticed at all. It's fine. You keep saying that. A faint breath escaped him. Neither spoke for several seconds afterward. Finally, she asked the question that had been sitting between them for hours. Were you planning to stay until we left? Yes. The answer came immediately. And after that, this time he did not answer right away. Then I don't know. That honesty unsettled her more than certainty would have. Because powerful men were supposed to sound sure of themselves. This man sounded tired of surviving. A nurse approached with discharge paperwork tucked against a clipboard. If his dizziness stays mild, you can probably take him home by noon, she explained gently. Relief crossed her so suddenly she had to steady herself against the wall beside her. The nurse noticed. So should you, she added softly. Only after she walked away did she realize the second sentence had not been directed at her. The man lowered his eyes briefly toward the floor. For the first time, he looked like someone who genuinely did not know what to do next. Not strategically. Emotionally. She studied him quietly then. The untouched coffee. The exhaustion beneath his eyes. The way he never crossed the doorway into her son's room unless invited by circumstance. And underneath all of it, something far simpler than danger. Loneliness. The kind people carried for years without talking about. You really thought they might come here, she said softly. His jaw tightened once. I thought they might follow me. And they did. A slight nod. But they left. Why? He looked toward her son's room before answering. Because I stayed visible. The meaning landed slowly. He had kept himself in the open all night on purpose. Not hiding. Not resting. Waiting where anyone searching for him could find him first. Away from the room. Away from the child. Inside the room. Her son stirred again and pushed himself halfway upright against the pillows. When he saw the man still outside the doorway, his tired face relaxed immediately. You stayed, he murmured. Yes. My mom says normal people go home after hospitals. Something fragile moved through the man's expression then. Your mom's right. Then why are you still here? The hallway fell silent around them. The man looked toward the child for a long moment before speaking. I wanted to make sure you woke up. Nothing else. No explanation about debt or guilt or danger. Just truth simple enough for a tired child to understand. And somehow that made it hurt more. By the time the discharge papers were signed, the rain had finally stopped. Morning light filled the hospital windows now, without asking permission from the storm first. Everything looked strangely ordinary again. Doctors changing shifts. Phones ringing at the front desk. People carrying coffee through the lobby like the night had never happened at all. Her son walked slowly beside her through the hallway. Still tired. One small hand wrapped around hers. The man waited near the entrance doors when they reached the lobby. Not close. Just there. Like he had been the entire night. Her son looked up immediately. You're leaving now. The man nodded once. I have to. The child seemed to think about that seriously. Then he reached into the pocket of his hoodie and pulled out the folded hospital crackers from breakfast earlier. You forgot to eat again. For a second, the man only stared at the packet in the child's hand. Then slowly, he took it. Thanks. Her son gave a tired shrug like it was obvious. Then he leaned briefly against his mother's side. Already exhausted again from simply being awake, the man looked at the child for another long moment before stepping back toward the doors, creating distance one last time. But before he turned away completely, she spoke. You stayed all night for someone you barely knew. He stopped. The lobby noise carried softly around them. Wheelchairs. Morning conversations. Traffic outside, beginning to build again. For a moment she thought he might leave without answering. Then he looked back toward her son, and when he finally spoke, his voice sounded quieter than it had all night. No. A small pause. I knew exactly who he was. After that, he walked out into the pale gray morning alone. He walked out into the pale gray morning alone. No dramatic goodbye. Just an exhausted man returning to a life that never really let him stop moving. She watched him through the hospital glass until he disappeared beyond the parking structure. Then she looked down at her son. He was already leaning sleepily against her shoulder again. Safe and alive beneath the weak morning sunlight. And for the first time since entering the emergency room, she understood what had really frightened her about the man who waited outside all night. It was not the violence surrounding him. It was how carefully he had tried to keep it from touching them.